Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for braving the elements and joining us at the Science Gallery tonight. I hope you're not too soaked. I hope you haven't got wet feet like I have. I'm Suzanne Hall. I'm Director of Engagement at the Policy Institute at King's College London, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this important discussion tonight. We're living through a period of rapid technological change where surveillance tools are becoming more sophisticated, more widespread, more embedded in our daily lives. So facial recognition technology, once the realms of science fiction, is now deployed by police forces across the country. And tonight we're going to explore some of the complex questions this raises about technology, about society, and about regulation. The government is at the moment actively considering new regulations governing the use of facial recognition technology. And the decisions that are being made today are going to shape how this technology is used for years to come, affecting how we move through public spaces, how we interact with law enforcement, and how we balance the competing priorities around security, privacy, and civil liberties. And at the Policy Institute, we've conducted new research into public attitudes towards police surveillance technology. And tonight, I'm going to share some of the key findings with you. The results, as they always do when you do work with the general public, reveal a very complex picture of public opinion, but it provides really valuable insights for policymakers when they're thinking about how to approach regulation. So key areas that our work explored included public awareness and understanding of facial recognition use. It's not going to surprise you to learn that that was patchy at best, and we'll go into some of that. Attitudes towards different applications and contexts, perspectives on the importance of accuracy, on oversight and accountability, and also views on balancing various considerations around security and privacy. We've also assembled a really experienced panel to help us examine these matters. And I'm just going to introduce briefly our speakers. Akiko is going to give you more on them in a minute, but we have Lord Tim Clement-Jones, former Liberal Democrats Lord Spokesman on Digital Matters, who brings extensive parliamentary experience. Daragh Murray, Senior Lecturer in the School of Law at Queen Mary University of London, whose research focuses on surveillance law and human rights. Ria Patel, Green Party Councillor for the London Borough of Croydon, who works on local government issues, including community safety and civil liberties, and Charlie Welton, Policy and Campaigns Officer at Liberty, who leads their work on surveillance and technology rights. Chairing it all, bringing it all together, is Akiko Hart, Director of Liberty. But I want to begin with a short presentation of our research data. And following this, our panel is going to then discuss the findings and offer their perspectives on the implications for policy and regulation. We're then going to open the floor up to you, the audience. We want some questions from you, so please do think about what you want to ask us as we go along. But I'm just going to flick through some of the findings, and I think the first thing to say is that the public are more comfortable than not with the police using facial recognition technology. So in our question to them, we explained how and why it's used, and we asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how comfortable they are with it. And 2 in 3 feel comfortable, including 3 in 10 who feel very comfortable. There is a sizable minority. There's 3 in 10 who express discomfort with all of this, and 1 in 10 are very uncomfortable. But the key thing to pull out here is that we track this question. So it was first asked in 2019, and we can see that in the intervening 6 years, public opinion has hardly changed at all. And so just to come on to the next slide, we also wanted to find out what is underpinning people's comfort or their lack of it with facial recognition technology. And the top 3 reasons among those who are comfortable with it are that it's beneficial for the security of society. So this is something that was mentioned by about a half. There was about the same proportion, roughly the same proportion, said that we have to do everything we can to stop crime. And 2 in 5 say, simply it just makes me feel safer, and that's why I'm comfortable with it. Other reasons given for comfort perhaps demonstrate the public's lack of understanding as to what the technology actually is, because they say it's things like, well, it's just the same as CCTV. They say that the technology doesn't discriminate by race and gender, and they say, well, the police already have a load of information about us, so why not use this as well? For those that are uncomfortable with the technology, then the top 3 reasons include, well, firstly, that it infringes on my personal liberty, and that's mentioned by just under half of the public. And similar, slightly fewer, 44%, say that it infringes on the privacy of all people in society. 2 in 5 say that they're uncomfortable with it because they can't opt out or consent, and other reasons given include that they don't trust the police to use it ethically, that it could be misused or it could be hacked, and simply that it normalises surveillance culture and it just doesn't align with their values and what they see as important for the functioning of society. We also dug into how and where this technology is used. And in this question, we asked people about live facial recognition technology specifically. And we provided participants with a bit of an explanation as to what it is. And we said to them, this is used by some police forces. It usually involves parking vans equipped with special equipment in busy areas to scan the faces of anyone who comes into range. We also explained to them that the faces are then matched in real time to images of people on watch lists, and that the watch lists can contain individuals who are of interest to the police, and that these watch lists can include people who have not been suspected or convicted of criminal activity. So we gave them a lot of information, so they were answering this question on the basis of having some knowledge about what the technology of it is. And among supporters, we found that nearly all, so that's 9 in 10, support its use at riots, including 7 in 10 who strongly support this, 7 in 10 who think that's a very good thing to do. Second most popular use for this technology is in and around football stadiums on match days. That's supported again by about 9 in 10, including over half who strongly support this, and there's a similar proportion who support its use at places like embassies. And among supporters, there's actually a good deal of support for its use in places like shopping centres, in public transport, just on the streets, at concerts, and in shops. The least appropriate places to use this technology are seen as being at strikes or industrial disputes. That's only supported by 2/3, at peaceful protests, which is supported by around the same proportion, and at places of worship, which is supported by just over half. But as you can see for that, even in these places, the places where people are kind of like less sure, then even majorities of this group still support the use of live facial recognition technology in all of these places. Digging further into this use of live facial recognition technology with the public, we asked the public who they thought should be on police watch lists. And here we did what's called a split sample. So we asked 1,000 members of the public one kind of wording, which was about violent crime, and we asked the other 1,000 people another kind of wording, which was about serious crime. And what we were trying to do there is just see whether wording or terminology makes a difference to what people have to say. Does it affect their views, their opinions? And we can see from the results that the wording has a small impact. So 7 in 10 think that someone who is reasonably suspected of a violent crime should be on a watch list. And 2/3 think that someone who is reasonably suspected of a serious crime should be included on a watch list. And away from that little experiment, then 3 in 5 think that someone with a previous conviction should be included on a watch list, while over 2 in 5 think that someone who is just suspected of a low-level crime, something like shoplifting, so not convicted, just suspected, should be on a watch list. Worth pointing out too that only 1 in 10 think that someone who is not suspected of any wrongdoing at all should be included on a watch list. But I've alluded to this earlier, and people's knowledge of facial recognition technology is patchy at best. So we did a small little true and false round with our participants, and I'm not going to test your knowledge, I'm not going to make you do the same questions as we got them to do. But what we found is only 1/3 correctly identified that public bodies and public forces, police forces, are free to use whichever surveillance technologies they like, and about the same proportion thought this was false. 1/3 think that the government closely monitors where and how facial recognition is being used by the police and other public bodies, so more people got the answer wrong here than right, because only 1/4 correctly identified this as false. 1/4 correctly states that there is little oversight as to how or when the police use facial recognition technology, and slightly more incorrectly say this statement is false. And finally, only 1 in 5 correctly identify the statement that UK laws regarding the use of facial recognition technology are much stricter than EU laws as false. Slightly more say it's true. And for all of these questions, you can see that there are really high proportions of don't knows as well. People just saying, I don't know what the answer is here. And I think that really does help sort of show the lack of knowledge that there is about this technology and the regulations that are in place. And this might explain the high support that the technology receives among the public. So the final two points I want to highlight from our survey are that public opinion isn't set in stone. People's views can change. And we wanted to explore this in more detail and get a sense of what might flip those who currently support the use of facial recognition technology into opposing it, and vice versa. So firstly, let's look at those people who support the use of the technology. And 2 in 3 say they'd change their minds to opposing it if people's personal data was lost or it was hacked. And a similar proportion say they would do this if the number of convictions increased, but more people were wrongly convicted. Just over half say they'd switch to opposing it if the technology was shown to discriminate against people from certain minorities. And highlighting the importance of safeguards, this is an important point, I think, then half say that if there was no oversight governing how and when the police use facial recognition technology, then they'd change their minds about it. They'd begin to oppose the use of it. But let's have a look at the other side, because we also asked those who oppose the technology what might start making them support it. And over half say they'd switch if the number of wrongful arrests decreased. Only slightly fewer say the same about if the number of wrongful convictions decreased. But I just want to finish by highlighting the importance of a good regulatory and safeguarding regime, because here we see that over half say that if there was more regulation governing how and when the police use facial recognition technology, then they'd change from opposing it to supporting it. So the thing to remember is that for both sides, for people who support it and oppose the technology, having regulations and safeguards in place is key. That's a real whistle-stop through what was actually quite a long survey with lots of findings at the end. There's much more on our website now, so you can dig into the data at your leisure. But I'm now going to hand over to Akiko Hart and our panel, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a really informative conversation. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, and welcome to everyone who is joining us from home as well. Some fantastic findings here, and we'll dig into all of it. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for introducing the panel. So what I am going to do is first invite everyone on the panel to share some of your initial reflections and reactions to the research. I might use chair's privilege to ask a question or two, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience so we can have a wider conversation around some of this. Tim Clement-Jones, would you like to give some of your initial reactions to this research?
Well, I was quite surprised when I heard the first couple of slides in terms of, is that really the case? Do they really have that level of support? And then in a sense, because, I've been a campaigner about regulation for live facial recognition, and I fully admit that I'm probably wholly biased in favor of regulation. I was, in a sense, not kind of reassured, but it certainly clarified the issues for me when I realized that actually the level of public knowledge about the oversight, the regulation of LFR was pretty low, actually. So, in a way, the two balance each other out. So maybe, the trouble is with us politicians, we're the victim of our own prejudices in a way. So I probably ingested the research and thought, that hasn't changed my mind a great deal, but I think it's very, very useful to have that granular kind of almost internal debate about what the public think about this, and really what the level of understanding, and then what would change their mind, which I thought was the really important aspect. And if regulation and oversight have a big influence in this area, then of course that confirms to me that that's what we need to keep campaigning for, basically.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Ria, over to you, because obviously this is a live issue in Croydon.
Yeah, definitely. I have ADHD, so I've made some notes, so if I'm looking down, that's why. But I guess my initial thoughts, to keep it brief, are that I was quite interested to see the number of people supportive of facial recognition, but also kind of the things that could change people's minds. And I think there is a question around kind of whether there is this public support that is maybe slightly superficial because there's a lack of that informed kind of knowledge as to how the technology is being used, kind of the implications of it being used and the biases potentially, and also the complete lack of regulation that exists. And it's also interesting to see kind of how the question is framed might change people's perceptions of facial recognition, and kind of whether the way in which the police present the information in consultations, for example, can influence people's opinions of whether they are supportive or not supportive of it. I think there's also that idea of people wanting to feel safe, and of course I think that people should feel safe in the communities they live in, and many people want to stop crimes from happening, which of course, again, very supportive of that. But I'm not convinced that facial recognition is the way in which we're going to get those things to happen. I don't believe that facial recognition should be used in a preventative way. I think that's a very slippery slope. But even when you're using it in a retrospective way, you've not really stopped crimes from happening. You're not preventing anything. The damage has already happened. And so one of the main reasons I think people gave of being supportive of facial recognition is that they wanted us to do everything we can to stop the crimes from happening. But I would argue that instead of investing in facial recognition, we should be investing in things like social infrastructure, housing, education, healthcare, things that are going to really reduce poverty and prevent crime from happening.
Cool. Yeah. Amazing, thank you. Daragh, you've done quite a bit of research around the chilling effects of surveillance. How surprised were you by these findings? Did they kind of match what you've seen before?
I think not too well, I'm surprised they haven't changed, I guess,
Yeah.
but maybe unsurprised that they're the same as before. But I think for me, it's the middle area that's really interesting. And I think the thing I'd like to talk about, I guess, is the uncertainty, or to the people who are uncertain, and maybe to explain a little bit what facial recognition is. I think it's really important to recognize that facial recognition is a really advanced surveillance technology, and the extent of its intrusiveness and how much it can infringe on rights is often underplayed. And I think it's maybe a way to frame it is that facial recognition doesn't just allow for the identification of anyone in public, it allows for the identification of everyone in public. And the combination of live facial recognition and retrospective facial recognition, which is when you look at historical footage or stored footage, means that the police can look at almost any record of public activity over a period of time, so they can look back in time and see who people talked to, who they were with, and where they were. And that's a huge change in police surveillance capability. And I think one of the reasons that we don't question it as much, or there's more uncertainty, is that it's because of the nature of the technology. As a remote technology, it's invisible. And I think things will be hugely different. You know, if you think of the use of facial recognition at a protest or a march or just in the streets, you know, if the police were stopping people, asking them for their ID, asking them who they were going to talk to, asking them where they had come from, there would be questions. You know, we'd want to know why the police were doing it. We'd want a really strong justification. And we'd be much more concerned, I think. But the fact that it's invisible and the fact that it's remote means that we just don't have that same friction. And so it almost happens in the background. So I think a lot of the uncertainty is because people just don't know what the true nature of facial recognition is.
Absolutely, and it's that lack of friction, I think, which is kind of key to that. Thank you. And Charlie, obviously this is something we've been working on for a while at Liberty. What were your kind of reactions when you saw this data?
Well, I mean, it has been something we've worked on for a long time. Actually, just last month was 5 years since Liberty won the first court case anywhere about police use of facial recognition. This was about a man called Ed Bridges, who was scanned by South Wales Police a couple of times, once on a busy shopping street and once at a protest outside an arms fair. And the Court of Appeal in that case found that South Wales Police and the legal framework they were basing it on didn't adequately protect our privacy rights, didn't take discrimination into account adequately, protect our data protection rights, equality law, any of these things. It was completely inadequate. But what we've seen since then, I mean, we saw some initial attempt to deal with the judgment, but what that did was it meant that we got quite an expansion in police use of facial recognition. The landscape now is rather different from it was back then. We've seen it spread across the country, lots more police forces are using it, more vans being rolled out, more deployments all the time. We've seen new forms of facial recognition that's being put into the hands of police officers with operator-initiated facial recognition, as it's known. We've seen a lot more retrospective facial recognition, also. I mean, we've seen a lot of arguments and research, such as Daragh's. We've seen millions upon millions of faces scanned, new legal challenges come up, but apparently what we haven't seen is anyone changing their minds on it, as we've just seen in the survey. But more importantly, what we haven't seen is legislation. We haven't seen Parliament come forward with proposals to regulate this, to do what other countries do, other jurisdictions around the world, and decide this is how this should be used. These are the safeguards that we're going to put into place. And I think it's really interesting in the survey how, whether you support it or whether you're against it, you see that need for regulation. Because where we are right now isn't good for anyone. It's, members of the public don't know how it's going to be used, don't know the protections they're going to have, and frankly don't have enough protections. The police, at the same time, they have to kind of come up with it a bit on their own, and they don't feel protected as well. It's why there's still all these legal challenges happening. What we need, and the good thing is that the Home Office has announced that they will be consulting on potential regulation. Of course, the same day that they announced that they were going to consult on these changes, they also expanded the capabilities massively of a load of new vans. A bit of a mixed bag there. So I'm sure we're going to get onto some of the specifics as to what we might want to see, but really this should have happened a long time ago. The time for regulation was years ago, but seeing as it didn't happen, we need it to happen now.
Absolutely, and we're going to come back to that, I think, and talk a little bit about what safeguards might look like, what guardrails could look like. I'm going to come back to the point that most of you have made, which is this really striking point that public opinion has not shifted in 6 years. Do you think the political narrative around facial rec technology has shifted in the last 6 years? Do you think there is more enthusiasm for it? What does that look like?
I mean, one of my thesis is there's far too much continuity in government, basically. I mean, the Home Office is still the Home Office, and their policies are almost exactly the same as they were under the Conservatives, under this Labour government. I mean, you look at the enthusiasm for live facial recognition, which has clearly been transmitted from the Met and South Wales Police and so on, and the Home Office is even more gung-ho under the current government than it was under the last. So, I mean, this is what makes me despair somewhat. And if you look at the more general aspect of AI regulation, which in a sense you could argue that live facial recognition is a subset of, I mean, they're even more casual, if anything, about thinking about the risks of AI and so on. It's even more Pollyanna-ish about the opportunities and so on and so forth. But they're extremely Pollyanna-ish about live facial recognition. It's going to solve all our problems in policing. No look, no hands. I mean, it's a real worry. And pushing back on that, I mean, and research like this is extremely helpful because you get to really understand, why there's this inertia, because there isn't a lot of public understanding. There isn't much pressure on politicians to actually regulate and do something about this. But of course, what you don't know is what's going to jump up and bite people if it goes wrong. Now, the trouble is you don't want to rely on that. You want to rely on principle, basically. I mean, the Ryder report that Ada Lovelace put forward, several years ago now, made it absolutely clear there's no proper framework for this deployment. The Bridges case mentioned, I think, both and Charlie, by Ria and Charlie. I mean, that again demonstrated quite clearly that there wasn't a proper legislative framework. But, it's almost as if politicians, the Home Office wants to ignore all that. And I think in the face of this, we have to be very, very clear. I'm just about to become the signatory to a letter that Big Brother Watch is sending to the Home Secretary, and we have to keep the pressure up, basically.
Yep. I saw you nodding there, Daragh, with the word Pollyanna-ish.
I don't know what that means.
You haven't read the book.
I know. I think, but to answer the question, there is a lot of appetite for it, and I think what we haven't seen is not just legislation, but we haven't seen evidence. So I think it's really important to take a step back and ask, why are we using facial recognition and what are we using it for, and what does it hope to achieve? You know, those are the fundamental questions before any legislation, and they also should be in place before any deployments. And I think one of the really interesting things is we see, you know, Charlie mentioned huge numbers, like millions of people's faces are scanned. We see a certain amount of arrests, but we have no information on what those arrests are for. So you get a lot of headline statements about how facial recognition has been used to catch a sexual predator, which is obviously good, but nothing about the other, you know, 400 odd people who have been arrested. And I think that's something that's really interesting. You know, even on the survey, people supported for violent crime. And when we did the review of the Met's facial recognition deployments years ago now, the statement was always that they were looking for people wanted of serious or violent crime. But at the time, the watch lists were about 300 people per deployment. Since then, we know that facial recognition can be used, according to the policy documents, to look for everything from, you know, theft to fraud to drug crimes, and also that the size of the watch list has increased from about 300 to just over 16,000. You know, so that's a huge, huge increase in people. So I think what I would say is we really need to know, you know, what have the results been of these facial recognition deployments? What is it used for? And then we can make an evaluation as to whether we want to use it or not. You know, human rights is all about the kind of the competing interests at play. You know, like the test is whether it's necessary in a democratic society, and that links to the utility, you know, in terms of protecting the public order, but also the potential harm in terms of the harm to human rights, to privacy, to freedom of expression. And we have to have the evidence to be able to make an accurate evaluation.
Absolutely, and it's incredibly opaque, isn't it, at the moment?
Super opaque, yeah. I know that word, yeah.
Yeah, no, we just don't have evidence. Ria, did you want to speak a little bit about how it's being deployed in Croydon?
Yeah.
Or about to be?
Yeah, I mean, live facial recognition has been being deployed in Croydon for multiple years now. I mean, it's been done kind of without that much public consent. It's kind of just being deployed, and then there's the aftermath, and you deal with the aftermath without actually properly engaging with the people that live in Croydon. There's been a few conversations at ward panels, which are kind of very hyperlocal police engagement kind of forums where the residents can come and ask questions about local issues. But that's very, very select, like few people, maybe 20 people in that very area, but not more broadly. And even with that kind of, and if they were to do more consultations, there's that question around who is it that will engage with the police, and will you get kind of a very homogenous kind of group of voices that do engage with the police, engaging with them on this issue. And kind of you'll probably be left with more global majority people not kind of speaking up about this or raising their views because of the kind of general suspicion that people might have of the police, and so you're not hearing all of the voices affected by the use of facial recognition. And now we're seeing kind of the instalment of permanent facial recognition cameras, which is even more concerning. But again, the police have they're going to spend this money to put it up, but they're only going to use it when they can find the resources to use it. So kind of they've invested a lot of money in getting it out there, but maybe it's not going to be used all the time, and it's going to be the equivalent kind of a live facial recognition kind of operation, but with permanent cameras. And that money and resource is really very intensive, and there's not that evidence to say that kind of this is the best way to go about kind of dealing with crimes and preventing crimes or catching criminals after crimes have happened. And what you were raising around kind of the lack of transparency with the data in terms of who is arrested, who is convicted, who's on the watch list, is very, very obscure. Yeah.
I can see you nodding there, Charlie.
Yeah, but this is just another way in which we're seeing new expansions in facial recognition. It's not just numbers, it's not just expanding into new areas, but it is things like the use of these fixed cameras, which we saw first earlier this year in Cardiff being trialled, and now in Croydon as well. It kind of gets at one of the things that I thought was interesting to see on the survey was to have the stats of something that we know through anecdote quite a lot, which is that people see it as no different from a CCTV camera. And that's an understandable position. Obviously, people don't know very much about facial recognition. It's you know, complicated, it's opaque, as we say. And so it makes sense that people think about it in that way. But it's really such a different proposition. It's, you know, the equivalent of crossing a border, of reaching a checkpoint, having to produce your identity wherever you go. It's very different from what we've been used to. And the installation of these new fixed cameras is a very concerning new development.
Very
here.
much.
You know, and one thing that Ria said is, you know, they won't necessarily always be on, but you won't know necessarily, which is a very concerning development. I think that with all of these things, with the new move towards fixed cameras, the expansion, the extra vans, all of this has happened while the government has been thinking about how they're going to regulate it. I think that's really entirely the wrong way around. If they see that there's potentially a need for regulation here, they really should not have been expanding it in this way at the same time.
Absolutely. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So we have an amazing panel of experts. So you may have like questions about the tech, about development. So I'm going to take through. Are there any roving mics over here? So should we start maybe with this side and then we'll move on? So gentleman in the middle, person at the front, and person in the dark shirt in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought it was an interesting presentation, but I thought it's also interesting that people want it to feel safer, but then they don't want it in their area, which is quite, you know, there are other anomalies in those as well as the big bit of unknown. My other question is, we talk a lot about regulation, but technology moves fast. So do we also look at what are the boundaries? I.e. will never link it to ID databases or passport ID. You know, that's a little bit different than regulation on how you use it. Is what are the boundaries to stop the creep, which I'm sort of slightly more concerned about. And also, how much do we follow the technology companies? So body-worn video, you can do live body-worn video now. The company sells it. So, you know, how do we keep ahead of the game rather than be reactive, be more proactive?
Absolutely. Thank you.
A few little questions.
Just three small questions. And can we pass it to the person at the front in the dark jacket, please? Thank you. Do two and then. Okay, great.
Thanks very much. Sweeling Harris, independent consultant. I was curious about the deployment of this technology in, as it were, private contexts. A friend of mine's son was recently caught suspected of shoplifting at a large chain store, and my friend was sort of confronted with this choice of signing away the kind of facial rights of their child to this store to be held for 5 years and a lifetime ban on entering the store, or interacting with the criminal system. And so I just would love to hear more. This was the first time I'd heard of it. I didn't probe further because I was too startled. So I'd love to hear from the panel about their thoughts on not just, as it were, public authorities' deployment of this technology, but private authority, like private power, using this technology. And a related point, whether the panel had any thoughts on the extent to which this technology is sitting within, obviously, broader structures of power and state power and inequality. And I imagine many of us sitting in this room understand the alarm, like have alarm bells when we see the words, you know, suspected of a minor crime. What does that mean? Like, on what basis? And were they suspected and then investigated and then it was dismissed? Are they actually a perfectly innocent person that was once upon a time suspected and therefore they're still on this list? And we know which communities get over-policed and unfairly suspected of things. So all of that to say, I'm curious for the panel's thoughts on to what extent we need to be thinking not only about the technology, but the broader systems and institutions and the questions of, is it a question of the technology and regulation of the technology, and or is it a question of the institutions and the powers that they hold and the way that they deploy that power? Thank you.
Wonderful. Tiny little questions to kick us off. So please take your pick. Where would you like to start?
Well, there are quite a lot of questions there. I mean, I don't think there's enough nervousness about surveillance generally. You know, we're one of the most surveilled Western European countries in terms of CCTV. I mean, Liberty has made that point many, many times, quite rightly. And so, we've been complacent about this for a very, very long time. Now, are people ignorant about CCTV? They can't be as ignorant about CCTV as they are about live facial recognition, because it's been around a hell of a lot longer, and it is more obvious with fixed cameras and so on and so forth. But there's almost like a cultural issue about this. And I think that's why, politically, it is quite difficult gearing people up to say, look, we have to have proper regulation, whether it's a judicial application that you have to make in order to use live facial recognition in certain circumstances. And, I think the circumstances that apply to the private sector, just to apply the supermarket point, I mean, I think you should need explicit permission to do that, because what they're effectively doing is scanning you for crime prevention purposes. So, I mean, they're in a sense an arm of the state in that respect. So, there definitely needs to be regulation over that. And I think over watch list creation, there needs to be much more control too. I mean, what worries me is if you like, the transparency about, who's on the watch list, how are the watch lists created and so on, is another issue that I know Liberty and Big Brother have all, and Ada have all mentioned, over time. So, I mean, I think what both questions raise are the problems, and, what we have to do is put forward robust solutions that say, we can cure this. These are, and we must acknowledge what these problems are, and the sharing issue, the data, where the data's going, where it's being shared to, how it's being analysed, and so on, I mean, is very important as well. And of course, it's not all about live facial recognition. It is about basically analysing old surveillance film, if you like, as well. So, we're not just talking about the newest technology, we're talking about, the whole data issue in crime and policing. And, trying to raise that when we dealt with the latest data use and access bill was utterly fruitless politically. The amount of buy-in you manage to get when you're trying to argue that police and security forces need to adhere properly to data protection rules falls on pretty dead ears in the Home Office, quite frankly.
As do many things, yes. Does anyone want to come in on the use of facial rec technology by private companies? I don't know if that's, or anything else that those two panelists.
Yeah, I can address. So very briefly on the boundaries, I think that's really important. I think, and Lord Clement Jones hinted at it, like a lot of the attention so far is focused on live facial recognition, and retrospective facial recognition has happened kind of without any scrutiny.
Yeah.
And I think retrospective is far more invasive, because live at the moment are kind of fixed term deployments, for say 6 to 8 hours in a fixed location, whereas retrospective facial recognition gives access to all stored footage, usually back for 31 days. So that's, nearly anything that happened in a public space in a city, and some private spaces too, I guess. And so that's lost. And then in terms of boundaries, the surveillance that's facilitated by facial recognition is also unaddressed. So some of the police data protection impact assessments talk about using facial recognition as a basis to track and monitor and profile people. And so that's very different from a static kind of CCTV identify someone. It's about building a pattern of life of somebody, tracing their movements across the city. And with something like facial recognition, it's relatively easy to do that and relatively cheap to do that. And so it's not constrained in the way like directed surveillance would have been, where you're putting somebody under surveillance who requires 8 to 10 police officers and a warrant. Now you can do nearly the same thing with the city at like virtually no cost. On the state power, the thing that makes me think of, I guess, is chilling effects of surveillance, which is something I'm really interested in. And chilling effects are said to rise when people modify or change their otherwise normal behavior because of the fear of surveillance. And so, like the classic example, like I'm Irish, obviously, I guess, you think of like the neck curtains twitching, and people watching and you have the social stigma about, how you're dressing or what time you come home from the pub. But it's most commonly linked to things like protest or political action. And the things we really do know I've done a lot of interviews with people all over the world about the chilling effects of surveillance, is that it has a huge impact, well, on people's mental health, but also on their ability to organize and to mobilize politically. So their ability to be an effective opposition or to be an effective voice or to launch a campaign is severely constrained. And the other thing we know is that chilling effects, and this is hinted at in the survey too, that chilling effects are felt most acutely by people who are opposed to the status quo or by marginalized communities. And in a democracy, they're exactly the voices you want to hear from. You know, we've seen with this government and the last governments, I guess, that we're in desperate need of new ideas. And if we're unintentionally constraining the space for those voices to emerge and for ideas to come through, you know, that has a really corrosive effect.
Deeply concerning. Okay, thank you. Just 2 questions in the middle, and then we'll move over to this side. So the individual, the dark shirt in the middle, dark hair, and the individual with the light blue shirt, please. Thank you.
Hi. How optimistic are you all that we can actually pause what's happening with facial recognition installation, etc., until regulation evolves?
Thank you. Person, just 2 rows in front. Yeah, thank you. Just do 2 rows.
Yes, I have 2 questions. The first one is about the research by the Policy Institute. I mean, the embassies listed as a distinct context or venue for the use of facial recognition. I mean, why is it individually identified as a distinct venue? And then what should we make sense of the public, I mean, favorable view on the use of facial recognition technology in near embassies? And then secondly, a completely unrelated question is about, I think, the benefits of the facial recognition technology. I mean, if UK has been under much video surveillance already, and it doesn't seem like it can make UK a much safer place and city, why should the public believe that the use of facial recognition technology will actually improve, I mean, crime and order? Because, I mean, I think there are too many news reports that the victims of the crime have gathered the CCTV footage, and then there seems to be a lack of resources in policing anyway, in investigating it. Then what's the point of gathering all these footages?
What's the point of it? But thank you. Charlie, Ria?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. So the embassy point, I think, is a really interesting one. And there are a couple of things here. I think that I was quite surprised also when I saw that. And I think the main thing is that a lot of people can't really picture being in an extreme situation in their life. I think we see this across all sorts of things. And so they might think, well, an embassy is a place where you might need a lot of security and so on. Now, of course, why we're concerned about facial recognition at embassies is in the case of political distance, in the case of protests potentially against states where people themselves, potentially their families, who might still be in these areas, may come to harm as a result of this. And what we're also seeing is the interaction of this stuff with other legislation. So there's legislation going on right now that would make it much harder to wear a facial covering at a protest. That's very much something that is good. You know, it protects you both your health, of course, in the wake of the pandemic, but also sometimes you don't want to be seen for very, very legitimate purposes. The embassy point, I thought, was a very interesting one and something that we are really quite concerned about. And just to answer briefly your second question as well, I think this is kind of, Daragh was touching on this. I think what we see is a lot of talk of the beneficial and positive results of facial recognition. When they catch somebody quite dangerous, they obviously speak about it quite a lot. And, you know, you would, certainly. What we don't hear about is all the very low-level offenders who are caught. We don't hear too much about misidentifications until they reach the level of a legal challenge. So you get quite a patchwork of view of all this, where the positive results are really amplified massively, and you get less talk about everything else. And you know, as we see in the survey, people just don't really know very much about it generally. I'm going to leave the optimism question to somebody else. It's not really my area, being optimistic about things.
You're not going to bite. did you want to
Yeah,
come in
I
on
guess
that?
just to add on about kind of your question, what is the point? And I think it's a really important question, and I don't have the answer because I don't particularly think there is a point in facial recognition. I think that people want to feel safe, as I said, and that can be addressed in many different ways, and you don't necessarily need to survey people for people to feel safe or to improve the environment around you. Thinking about social infrastructure, public health measures, mental health kind of crisis teams and housing, education, etc. Investing in those areas instead, I think, would be much better use of public resources. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Should we take a couple over there, please? So the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then the gentleman in front of them, and then we'll get to everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Hopefully, most people.
Yeah, right now we have a man in Downing Street who is admittedly a self-confessed globalist, and Davos is more important to him than Westminster. Anyone who wants to accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist, that is fact. He's online saying that. Basically, I'm stupefied that no one on the panel has brought up the issue of the World Economic Forum. This is a totally unelected body that no one has voted for. I've read The Great Reset, and I've also read Klaus Schwab's other book, which is known as The Fourth Industrial. It's absolutely terrifying. You will own nothing and have nothing. You will basically, he wants to work for the dismantleization of society. Why is no one on this panel bringing up the wider issue of this fifth column that has infiltrated governments around the world? Why is no one talking about it? I'm suspicious. I mean, right now Starmer is trying to use the migrant crisis and everywhere else to bring in so-called brick cards. This is basically applied behavioural psychology. Please tell me your feelings on the World Economic Forum, and it's a fifth column, and what should be done. In my opinion, it should be a prescribed organisation.
Thank you. And then, person in front, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Anthony Frost from Team Global. Now, I just wanted to clarify, how widespread is the use of facial recognition? Do the police have to announce if they're going to use it? And thirdly, are other organisations using it? Thank you very much.
Some clarifying questions there. Did you want to? Yeah.
I can start on how widespread, I guess, the facial recognition is used. So live facial recognition has been used since about, well, in its modern incarnation, since about 2016, primarily by the Met and by South Wales Police. Since then, to my knowledge, about 2 or 3 other police forces have used it, but as Charlie mentioned, the Home Office are setting up a system of vans that any police force can, make a case to use facial recognition and then bring the vans with them. So whereas before the cost, I guess, was the technology and the ability to deploy it. So relatively widespread on facial recognition, given that London is by far the biggest city in the UK. The retrospective facial recognition, which is using facial recognition against stored images, until recently we didn't know how widespread it was, but Liberty Investigates and others have done a lot of really good work to examine it. And despite the fact that a lot of police forces don't have any public policy to regulate how it's used, or a lot of them have said that they have never used it, every police force in the UK has been using retrospective facial recognition, and the incidence, I guess, has gone up exponentially.
I mean, just to add to that, we've been fobbed off for quite some time with the College of Policing guidance, which is meant to have been the great thing, to make sure that everything was hunky-dory as far as using live facial recognition was concerned. But really, that is just, it is wholly inadequate. Contrasted with what could be done in terms of legislation. I mean, I'll just answer the World Economic Forum point. There are lots of organisations that have influence on government. I mean, my particular bête noire is the Tony Blair Institute, I have to say. But, I don't think we should outright ban them. They may have people who have no contact with reality, which, there are quite a lot of think tanks like that knocking around. But I hope that, we listen to those who really know what they're talking about. And, it's great, actually, that there is quite a, tight group of campaigning organisations that have worked so well and closely together over quite a long period of time in trying to get a proper result on regulation of live facial recognition, and indeed, increasingly on retrospective facial recognition.
Absolutely. Did you want to come in at all on any of those questions?
I might just quickly answer your point on whether they have to notify people before. Well, they do, but really what we usually see with this is a little tweet will go up saying we're going to use it today, and then near a van will be a sign saying that live facial recognition is in progress. I mean, how many of you follow your local police force on Twitter? I mean, I don't, and I work for Liberty. So how many people are going to see that?
I've studied facial recognition, obviously, for years, been on a huge number of live facial recognition deployments. I was out for, I was going to dinner one day, I was stopped at a cash machine to get cash out, turned around and realised I'd walked straight through a full deployment, like gone through all the signs, gone past the van, I was literally standing beside the police. So even when it is announced, I think it's often inadequate.
Yeah, it's really easy to miss. Great, thank you. 2 here, please. Oh, actually, should we do 3 here? Yeah, in a row. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the sharing. It's really insightful. My name is Jessica Learn. I'm a criminal defense solicitor based in Essex, and I'm also a newspaper columnist. Well, I share with the panel that there's obviously issues with the legitimacy, the stereotypic effect with facial recognition, let alone the fact that the public will be watched, even when they have nothing to do with any crime. But I also understand the public sentiment in terms of feeling safer. As Ria has pointed out, I mean, well, a lot of people, they support the facial recognition because they just want to do everything you can to stop crimes. So in terms of this, or to tackle this concern, like what would the panel suggest as either as an alternative or anything in the short term, or even any quick fix, although I don't believe there will be any quick fix, but anything in the short term that we can tell the public that we don't need facial recognition, but we need something else. Thank you.
Pragmatic policy question there. What are the alternatives? Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Spain. I used to be an actuary, which gives me an interest in the statistical methodology. If you take the very first slide, the way we looked at the slide, on the left were the people who were basically in favour, the people on the right were the people who said no way. Now, I'm assuming that none of the sample were actually in Belmarsh at the time when the survey was completed, but you could not have known how many had been already convicted justly of serious crime or terrorism. And if there had been any such people, that would have skewed the right hand. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how you're ever going to do that, but you should think about the extent to which that could have skewed that away from, yeah, it's a pretty good thing. Secondly, in terms of the Met Police saying, we're going to do this, North West London, they have come to us, talked to us about it, and published that they're going to be bringing it into Harrow Town Centre, for example. So they're being fairly open, which makes me suggest that the campaigns on this may have been more vociferous and hence less efficient than if you tried to make friends a bit and said, we see where you're trying to go, but just do us a favour, help us understand the evidence you have, the controls that have been implemented, and by the way, who is looking at those controls?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going on a slightly different tangent. I'm currently doing my master's thesis on how the criminal justice system treats victims of crime. So when you had the slide, which was about attitudes, but saying that some people felt it was completely reasonable to use facial recognition on victims of crime, it just raises so many alarm bells. Does that mean we know that a lot of crimes are underreported? If I knew that I would have to go to a police station, have my photo taken, and then the police were going to retrospectively check, we know about Christie's perfect victim, etc., etc., how is that going to increase justice for victims of crime?
Absolutely, unintended consequence there. Thank you so much. What would you like to take?
Well, just a couple of things, not all the questions, but what are the alternatives? Well, I think there may be a disagreement at the end of the day about whether or not at all live facial recognition should be used. I mean, when we were arguing for a moratorium some years ago, it was impossible really to get a consensus on So what happens after the moratorium? I think there's a bit more clarity. I mean, I would like to see, you know, some sort of risk-based assessment. I'd like to see some sort of judicial warrant system for particular circumstances in which live facial recognition is important. It could be catching terrorists. It could be, you know, very, very high risk of particular types of crime. But I wouldn't discount it altogether. But there are some, you know, in fact, there may be many who don't want live facial recognition to be deployed at all. But that is an argument still to come when we've got some form of acceptance that regulation is needed. So I do think that's really a question that we need to resolve. And you know, that debate I think is still ongoing. The skewing of the data I think is very much for the academics, basically. I'm going to duck that one entirely. And I can't read my own writing, but I certainly don't believe that you know, we can just rely on the police out of their bounty to tell us what's going on, basically. I think there should be, you know, firm duties for public communication. There should be firm duties for warrants to be obtained, and whether it's judges or, you know, other form of regulators, surveillance camera commissioners or whatever, to be assured and therefore to have the evidence that it's being properly conducted, and then to know, you know, what the watch list consists of, and that it's all being conducted properly. You know, I just don't think it's a tenable situation just to simply expect the police to be nice to us and tell us what's going on for a change. You know, I think we have to have proper duties applied.
Absolutely. Susanna, is it okay if I hand over to you just to answer the question?
Just to sort of chip in on that. I think in research we would term people like that as hard to reach. They're hard to get to. You can't get them to take part in research even when you want them to. So I think the likelihood of them skewing a sample, we're only dealing with 2,000 people, and we have quotas, so we know what the sample of the UK population should look like. So we have quotas that we try and work to. We also go through a whole series of tests before we do the data collection properly to make sure that the people we're getting are the right kinds of people as well, and then the data are weighted at the end of it to match the population profile. So it's something we're always alert to. And we're always alert to kind of like, does the data look wrong? I remember on my first day of researcher training, I was told if it's interesting, it's wrong. So that's something that we're always kind of trying to keep an eye on. You know, is it being skewed? Is it, you know, increasingly like, are we getting overtaken by synthetic participants, and you know, people just kind of like flicking through an online survey and not considering the questions, which is why we do things like changing the wording and tweaking the ordering. So it's a really good concern to raise, but I'm really confident in the data that we've got that it's of a good standard and not squeezed. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to come in briefly on alternatives, policy alternatives?
Well, you know, that's partly why I support, in, you know, for violent crime, for terrorism and so on, as long as you have the proper form of regulation, and that begs the question what the proper form of regulation is. That's why I think it can be useful if it's properly justified. But, you know, at the moment it's not being properly justified, and it's being applied over a far wider range of crimes than I think is legitimate. But, you know, so I think in certain circumstances it is a useful tool.
Yep. But we keep on coming to this this question of safeguards.
All the time.
Great. Okay, so there's the person with the red hair. Yep, there. Yep, and then there's two people in front of them.
Well, I just wanted to say, considering the police don't know what they're doing when they're doing it, this will just give them another avenue to cock up. Because, I mean, the man upstairs has been, he has 100 CAD reports against him, and they still haven't arrested him with finality. And he'll continue to sort of misbehave and commit antisocial acts. The police are well aware of it, and they do nothing. So this is just going to give them another avenue to do nothing. Plus, it's going to invade our human rights completely. I also think, as a PS, that even the selfies that are taken without your permission at events any place at all should be banned unless they get your permission. I'm always having people taking photographs, and I don't like it. Not because I don't like being fawned over, I do, but I think it's an intrusion, a very, very crass intrusion, and we take it for granted. And people can use those photos in different ways, frame them, contextualize them, so you look, you can look bad even if you're doing nothing wrong. This is a very kind of seminal and significant aspect of current society, how people interact today. It's a negative interaction, it's negative energy.
Thank you. And then I think there were so many people. Yes, yeah, and then maybe the person.
Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating discussion, and thanks everyone on the panel and in the audience for your contributions. Before coming tonight, I spoke to two people, intelligent, smart, reasonably well-informed people, to say that I was coming here and what the subject was. And both of them said, well, if you've done nothing wrong and you've got nothing to hide, then you don't need to worry about it. Plus, if it keeps the streets safer, ... then it has to be a good thing. And I was startled by that. I mean, the converse or the complement to that is if you think differently, you're automatically a conspiracy theorist. We know that's not the case. We know about the abuse of power. We know that in the modern age, it's not even about nation states anymore. It's about big tech, and it's international, and it's effectively lawless. And the last thing I'd want to say, it's not really a question, but I do think a lot of this comes down to our own media and news outlets and how they're owned and how they disseminate the narrative, because, as I say, those were two smart and reasonably well-informed people that I spoke to, and I was alarmed by their views. Thanks.
Thank you, and we'll be asking the panellists how to respond in the moment to those questions. And yes, and your
okay, yeah, no, my name is Philip Ingleson. I used to research in what's called responsible innovation, things like AI and so on. Yeah. I'm now retired, but I don't think you ever really retire from that, especially now. I don't know if people read the article, I think it was in The Guardian today, or maybe yesterday, by Brian Paddock, saying that he's in favour of live facial recognition, and one of his reasons is that there's only about 1 in 33,000 false positives, which doesn't sound too bad, you know, oh, it must be real. But I was thinking, well, if we get to the stage where we're all being on live facial recognition all the time, you know, maybe 10 or 20 times a day, wherever you go, you know, that's going to add an awful lot of data points. So I guess the question is that actually kind of a realistic scenario? Can you foresee that kind of, because we've got all these CCTV cameras after all everywhere, you know, they used to be a rarity and now they're literally everywhere, you know, 6 or 10 or whatever is on every single bus, every single tube carriage. And I guess the other point, which is kind of related, is in thinking about regulation, I mean, Lord Berners-Lee did mention this, but it's only been mentioned briefly, is what's going to happen with the data, you know, because you think about like the big tech companies they know what they're doing with their data. They're not just using it for, you know, oh, that's interesting. They're actually doing enormous amounts of analysis to, you know, to what's the word, work out what people like and don't like. So you could imagine that could be extremely useful and, frankly, rather dangerous data.
Fantastic, thank you. And the panelists might have some thoughts actually as to the quality of that research as well. I don't know, China, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. Three very interesting questions. I think for one thing, if you have 1 false positive and 33,000, well, the Met's been scanning millions of faces. I mean, I'm not great at maths, but that sounds like too much, even if we don't get into the dystopian kind of idea that you're putting forward, which, you know, again, once they start to put up fixed cameras, once that's seen as viable and you know, a better solution than vans, then why wouldn't you put up more? So we get then to the question of, well, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Well, I've got nothing to hide, but I still have curtains in my house. Like, it doesn't mean that you don't want your privacy, that you don't value your privacy, even before we get into questions such as false positives and so on. I think that the idea of not having anything to fear from surveillance technology because you are a fine, upstanding member of society, I think is a nonsense. I think, privacy is a human right that we all enjoy, and we shouldn't have to give it up just for this. Your point about the police making mistakes, they do all the time. And one of the answers to that is to have really robust legislation in place, so it's very clear, lays out exactly what the police can do, what they cannot do. We all know about it. We know what to expect. The police know what to expect. It's not being made up on the hoof, and it's very clear about when you can use this technology, how you can use this technology, what safeguards are in place, what you have to do each time, and as well that there should be independent oversight as well, so they're not marking their own homework.
Yeah. Oh, Ria, do you want to go?
Yeah, just on this point around kind of if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear, it really assumes that the law is being applied justly and that everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. And we know that's not the case. We know that there is racial bias which pervades society. That's prevalent in the police forces, as well as other institutions, like, for example, when privatized companies are using the technology, like supermarkets. And when you come to kind of like that issue around storing the data, I think that's even more concerning when it's in the hands of the private companies, and there's complete kind of lack of transparency as to where that's going. I've completely forgotten the second point that you raised.
It was just to do with profiling, basically, and use of WhatsApp.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really concerning when you think about the racial bias that is pervasive around in society, and then the way in which the kind of data is compiled with the watch lists, for example. So we hear about the accuracy kind of percentages, and 1 in 33,000, whatever the figure is. That's still one person being stopped, or like maybe a couple tens or hundreds when you scale it up. And there was an instance, for example, in Croydon when someone, anecdotally, was stopped falsely, was on the way to a date, and it's very kind of disruptive being stopped, obviously. Then he was late to the date. How do you explain to your date that you were stopped falsely by live facial recognition? It's super kind of just embarrassing, disruptive to people's lives when they are falsely stopped. And then there's also the bias around kind of how are the watch lists being compiled, and then the bias in the police forces within themselves as institutions.
Yeah, multiple levels of bias. Sorry, can you
yes, I mean, the lady talked about, selfies and so on. I hope she keeps a very close eye on Instagram and make sure that inadvertently nobody's taking her photo. But I mean, broadly speaking, I think there's quite a polarized view about data. I mean, there's on one end, people are very casual about their data. When it comes to their phones and other forms of sharing information and so on. On the other hand, there are others, and I count myself as one of them, who are rather careful about the data that they share and allow people to access. But we have a very, very disparate culture on that, and that's what makes this debate quite interesting as well. I mean, I think that explains partly the results that we've seen, because some people have a very blithe view about their data. Others, are very process-driven and really want to know and really want to be assured that their data is safe. And you've seen the debates over the National Health Service data and so on and so forth, people opting out. On the other hand, other people saying, well, it's health data, everything's fine. So I think we've still, as a society, we haven't really got a settled view about this, which I think is a bit worrying. The beauty of being ancient and dealing with arguments like, if you're doing nothing wrong, there's nothing to fear. I mean, the police have been using this argument. I mean, I advised MPs on the 1983 police, I think it's Police and Evidence Act, something like that. And the police were using that about improving the procedure in police stations. Why do we need to go through all this paperwork? These people, I mean, these are crimes, these are criminals we're dealing with. So I think we just have to keep pushing back and saying exactly in the way Charlie says, look, these are fundamental rights and they need to be observed. As far as innovation is concerned, all the time, and regulation is concerned, there's this big narrative that has been mounted by big tech, principally, saying that regulation is the enemy of innovation. Well, innovation is not neutral. Its innovation can be good or bad. It isn't necessarily wonderful just by being innovation. It must be something that is for the benefit of us as a society. So, if I think that we're going to turn into Blade Runner and have a sort of dystopian society where our every move is tracked, then I'm not going to enjoy that very much. It may be highly innovative, but quite frankly, I'm going to push back on that, and I think we all should. So, and I have my arguments with Brown. He's no longer, I hasten to say, the Lib Dem spokesperson for Home Affairs in the House of Lords. He's now an advisor to the Met Police, which may give the clue to why he's suddenly become a fan of live facial recognition. It's funny how these things happen, basically. But I do respect his view about policing on the ground, but I'm afraid I diverge quite heavily from him on this whole question of LFR.
Yeah.
Can I say something? I just wish we were as annoyed about the surveillance that takes place on our mobile phones, because they're already profiled. Yeah.
Thank
you. It's absolutely disgusting. I don't know if I'm the only one that feels it every day. It's offensive. So I just wish there's another discussion about all the information that is out there about all of us. Just from us.
Maybe Kings feel another research
yes,
project.
Yes, there we go. Mobile phones. Thank you. Daragh, did you want to?
Sure, just super quickly on the nothing to fear and nothing to hide, I'd link it back to the chilling effects, and I'd echo what Rio was saying about the fact that certain communities have a legitimate reason to distrust the police because of the history of discriminatory policing, but also that the boundaries, particularly in a protest context, the boundaries of what's lawful and unlawful are really unclear. In the last number of years, there's been a lot of changes to legislation to classify what used to be the offence of disruption to serious disruption, or vice versa, and back again. And so it's really unclear as to what is lawful and what's not. And if I can, just very briefly on the victims of crime, I think I've spent a lot of time, too much time maybe looking at police policy documents, and I think the one thing that's really clear is that there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lack of specificity. And I think one of the things that I would be concerned about is, how is a victim of crime identified? How are they defined? And then there's also maybe a legitimate reason that somebody doesn't report a crime, so they don't want to go to the police station for something. And I think you have to put that in the context of what a live facial recognition stop is. Because of the way facial recognition deployments are set up, there's a relatively small window of opportunity between the time somebody is flagged on a camera and the ability of the police to engage them. So what happens in practice is that it's a very, very intense, very rushed experience, where somebody is stopped out of nowhere and they're swarmed by police who are holding up, devices to their face, trying to evaluate whether they're who they are or not, and to put a victim of crime or a potential victim of crime through that on top of everything else, and on top of things like being late for a date or just the disruption to your day. It's a really important issue.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left, unfortunately, so I won't be able to take any more questions from the audience. So what I'm just going to do is just invite you to share a couple of really brief concluding remarks. And my question to you really is, how do we bring people with us on this? In a couple of words, how can we convince people who are positive or not as skeptical as perhaps they could be about facial rec technology?
Well, I think we have to take every opportunity that there is, particularly in Parliament, when legislation is going through and there's new crime and policing the bill that's coming through, to try and make the case, publicly, with all the civil society organisations who are so, such powerful voices in this, and try and, make the case at the same time. But, the police have a very big share of voice on this. They can publish all kinds of statistics. They've got the National Physical Laboratory, which publishes what I think are rather misleading reports about the accuracy of live facial recognition. They've got a number of tools there that they can use, and the Home Office is pretty intransigent. So we're up against, some big barriers. But I think actually we have to frighten people a bit, really.
You have to frighten people. Cool. Thank you.
I don't think it should be up to us to convince people. I think it should be up to the state to convince us. And they should, if we're going to deploy these really advanced technologies, there should be an evidence base and there should be a justification, and then we can make an informed decision.
Amazing, thank you.
Yeah, I fully hear what you're saying, and I do think that. But I also think that there's a massive number of people who don't really understand the technology at all. Kind of, they hear the headlines but don't understand the intricacies of kind of how watches are formed, how the data is used, how the data is stored. And I think the onus is on us as well to speak to our friends and families and communities about kind of these issues and have like more in-depth conversations, bring people along with us, as well as the kind of onus on the state and the onus on the government.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And also, you know, what we saw in the survey was a lot of don't knows. A very large number of people just don't know very much about this, and they're there to be spoken to. And, you know, we can go out and speak to our friends, speak to our families, and really sort of get them to a point of understanding what's at stake here. And, yeah, hopefully we can end up in a place that protects everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much for the amazing panel. Thank you. I believe there are some drinks and nibbles through the doors over there, so we can continue this conversation. Thank you.